Hi everyone, I hope you are doing great. In this video, I want to share some extraordinary points related to the Idaho murder case. I am almost sure many of you find this video absurd, odd, ridiculous, or whatever else, which is absolutely okay with me. Even if my theory seems strange to you, please make sure you do not let it go without thinking about it. By reflecting on it, I am sure many of you will reach a similar result, or at least will agree with me on many parts. Please be mindful that whatever I am presenting in this video is based on my analysis, and I have no intention of accusing anybody of anything, so I thank you all in advance for keeping the points in mind, and let's get started. From the beginning of the case, I have had the feeling that the state's approach has been like providing us with pieces of several different puzzles, while they have taken many key pieces intentionally and strategically not to let us be able to solve any of them. Still, I have been trying to put together some of the pieces of one of these multi-puzzles to come up with a theory that is just as likely to be right as it is to be wrong. Still, it is the only theory I can consider for this case. As the guiding piece of the puzzle, I reviewed some contradictory parts to see what I could find. One of the controversial matters is their key evidence thing, which is the knife sheath. The MPD claimed they had found a knife sheath under Maddie's body, on which they could find a trace of Brian's DNA. In what situation could his DNA be found only as a single trace on the button snap? We know that, as a basic practice for any criminal, using gloves is essential to avoid being identified. Few criminals may not wear gloves when committing a crime. Since this case has been described in the most nonsense or ridiculous way by the MPD, let's consider every sensible and even nonsensible situation to see if there could be any condition consistent with what has been claimed by the investigators, who, according to their investigations, Brian has been accused of the murder. There are two possibilities that either the criminal had worn gloves or not. If he had worn gloves, then how could it be possible his DNA's trace had been left there on the button snap? And if he had been so stupid that hadn't worn gloves while going to kill 4 people, why should have left only a single trace of DNA? However, it is expected at least several of his fingerprints, his bloodstains, the victim's blood, or his sweat residue had been left on the knife sheath, so why only one trace? Since I want to find out a situation in any way that can match what has been claimed about his DNA trace, let's even consider the silliest situation that anybody may have ever done. Even if I want to presume he had worn any kind of glove with a hole in one of its fingertips, which may limit his skin to contact with any object, still in such a situation, there should have been more than a single trace of touch DNA, not only on the knife sheath, but also any object which is possibly in contact with his finger. Therefore, either more or none. Probably some people think that he might have cleaned the knife sheath before going for the crime. Was he supposed to leave the knife sheath at the murder scene and clean it beforehand to not let him be identified? Which is ridiculous. Did he know he was going to leave it there at the murder scene? Even if we want to presume the cleaning of his knife sheath was a precautionary act of him, in case it was left behind, there would be nothing on it to lead him to be identified. But the killer with the lowest level of IQ has the foresight to secure the knife sheath to his belt or gear with its loop or straps, to ensure it wouldn't be left behind in the first place, rather than cleaning it. I never accept even for 1 second that the murderer had kept the sheath in his hand, and during the fight, he had dropped it and forgot to take it with him. If the knife sheath had been found at the murder scene, maybe it had been added to the scene later, or even by the murderer himself, to deceive and distract the investigators, and he must have had his own knife without a sheath, or he might have secured it on his belt. The knife sheath that had been left at the murder scene couldn't have been related to the murder weapon, whether it had been left there by the killer himself or by other people after the incident. That knife sheath must have been left there to mislead the investigators, and by whoever had put it at the murder scene. Once I heard a statement by Mr. Goncalves to the effect of, the murderer had had a murder kit with him, which caused me to think he must have used a knuckle duster too. But when I saw these knife pictures, I thought it was very probable, and that the murderer's knife had been one of these kinds because he had no time to change his weapon and use it separately. Then this situation makes it acceptable that the murderer had put the wrong knife sheath to not being identified for having this special kind of knife later, and wanted to mislead everyone that the murder weapon had been a K-bar knife. Another strange point related to the DNA sample that was said to be a perfect match to his father's DNA and not with his own DNA. But why? Isn't it a little strange? To find the reason, I tried to find Brian's father's very first presence in this case. The result was this moment. As we know, Brian and his father were stopped by the police twice within less than 10 minutes on their way to Pennsylvania. Let's see what we can find here. In this video, something caught my attention too, which was the way the officer approached their car. Did you notice how cautious he was? Let's watch it again in slow motion. I searched for the meaning of the officer's behavior, and I found this.
1. Police officers touch the vehicle during a traffic stop primarily for their safety. By leaving their fingerprints on the car, they create a physical record that proves they made contact with the vehicle. This can be useful if something goes wrong during the stop, such as if the driver tries to flee or harm the officer. It's a precautionary measure to ensure there is evidence of their interaction with the vehicle. 2. Ensuring the trunk is closed. Sometimes officers touch the car to check if the trunk is properly closed. This is a precautionary measure to ensure that no one is hiding in the trunk who could pose a danger to the officer during the stop. 3. Distracting the driver. The sound or sensation of the officer touching the car can also serve as a minor distraction, causing the driver to focus on the rear of the vehicle. This gives the officer a moment to observe the driver's behavior or reach for something that might pose a threat. This practice is rooted in traditional police training and is still commonly used by many officers today, even though modern technology like dash cams and body cams provides additional ways to document encounters.
Doesn't it seem too much cautious for a traffic stop? Was he so careful for it might have told him about Brian being suspected? However, it seems to me that contrary to what was pointed out in the subtitle, the officer stopped him knowing he was suspected and a risky matter. Also, in such a situation, couldn't it be easy to access a strand of his father's hair or a single skin crust, as anybody may have on their shirt specifically, when the officer approached them through his father's side and not the driver's or Brian's side? I think they first accessed his father's DNA and then his own DNA, maybe to pretend they reached Brian as the suspect through a complicated investigation and in fact to mislead the public's mind from the point that they had chosen and wanted Brian to be the suspect of the murder and then tried to gather evidence to fit him, which is the reason that X terabyte evidence and a mountain of documents couldn't be compelling for his accusation because there is a gap or split between the truth with what is pretended to be the truth. I have a guess now, but let's go a little further. Then I will share my guess with you. I'm sure almost everybody remembers Brent Capazza was killed by a SWAT team in a very suspicious way and over a very bizarre excuse. I see a relation between this incident and the quadruple murders. He was killed by the SWAT team while not even holding a memorial service for him in his honor as a veteran. To me, it is very probable that any pause or focus on his death could be risky for the state. Therefore, they wrapped up his case very fast. Also, I noticed after Brent Capazza was killed, the MPD didn't use a plural form for occupant anymore, while before it, they were unsure about the number of the white Elantra's occupants. So after Brent had been killed, it seemed they were sure about only Brian being the guy. Have you ever heard of Freudian slip, which is an unintentional error in speech, memory, or action that is believed to reveal unconscious thoughts? I believe it is one of those Freudian slips. How could they be so sure that forgot even to act at least as if they had been concerned about this matter and had investigated to be sure there wasn't any other person involved? They knew from the very beginning that Brian wasn't the killer, let alone have any accomplice for the murder. Their unconscious mind exposed their manipulating approach. Thus, I think they found out that Brian and Brent were aware of the murder process. Of course, to me, there must have been at least one other person, if not more, other than Brent and Brian. When Brian was arrested and asked if there was anyone else arrested, he knew that Brent had been killed by then. Therefore, at least another individual must have been involved in what Brian and Brent were involved. But what kind of involvement must they have had in the case? I am sure Brian would have had the same fate as Brent Kopaka by now if he hadn't been smart enough to want his father to reach out to him in his residence to say whatever he knew about the case in person, rather than through a technological intermediary like phone or email. Now let's take a look at another piece of the puzzle, which is demolishing the house where the murder happened. When I looked back to see the events that happened before the house was demolished, the most noticeable one that could have had a direct influence on the university's decision to destroy the house would be the testimony of experts like Ms. Gabriela Vargas and Mr. Tse Ray, which were a loud warning for the state that showed them their key evidence pieces were so weak and unreliable that would better them to take serious action to make them ready for Brian being freed. So, they had to do something in advance to make a run route for two specific occasions, one for during the trial, and the other one for after the trial when Brian will be freed. Because after Brian is released, the public wants to know who the real killers are. Therefore, by destroying the house and murder scene, the chance for the jury during the trial, and for the public after the trial, will be the least to find any potential evidence that shows the identity of the killers, the motive of the murder, or both. This means the state is attentive to accepting the innocence of Brian, and nothing more, and the case will be ended at that point. I am sure if the trial was supposed to be held in Idaho, the state's power to end the case by releasing Brian would be much more by far. But now, by trial being held in another county and under the supervision of another judge, they not going to have their favorite end. And finally, the key or the golden piece. Of course, according to my analysis, my theory, and my way of understanding the case, some of the contradictory matters, because of having crucial importance in the case, have been discussed on social media and mainstream media strategically on and off to numb the public's minds against them, and after some time being cleared out of their minds, or at least to fade their importance in the public's eyes. One of these kinds of matters is the stalking issue. Please pay attention that in this case, there have always been two ways of stalking, which were talked about everywhere, but most people speak about them interchangeably. 1. Kaylee was being stalked in person. 2. Some of the victims were being stalked through social media. Let's watch some videos on this issue.
Say they've received hundreds of pieces of information that victim Kaylee Concavs had a stalker, but they haven't been able to verify that she had a stalker.
We obtained information through some of our interviews that Kaylee had made some comments about a stalker, so that's where that came from. We have followed up looking at specific time frames in specific areas of town. So far, we have not been able to corroborate it, but we're not done looking into that piece of information.
All right.
During the 2 years, the matter of stalking, too, has been the topic of some content on and off. The matter of Kaylee being stalked by someone has been suspiciously approached by the MPD, the media, and even the Goncalves family.
Have actually had a stalker. I asked her family to clear that up.
Can you talk a little more about, a lot of people have been wondering if Kaylee had a stalker, if that was really true?
I said this, she's a pretty girl, her friends are really pretty, so them attracting attention was pretty common wherever they went. So I think she attracted attention, whether that's a dedicated person following her around, maybe not. I do believe that the officers looked in it, and I believe what they said, that there was no evidence there.
Are you confident with the way they're investigating?
I think it's hard to say this way or that. They're obviously holding it very tight to chest, which could either be a really, really great sign or really, really bad sign. And I think depending on not even the day, the hour, especially my dad and I, we go back and forth between they got this and kind of falling apart a little bit and, really looking at specific events that have been strange or maybe should have been looked into more in our eyes.
For Kaylee, though, there was something weighing on her mind, and she had confided in her parents about it. She felt that someone in the town had been watching her.
Did Kaylee ever talk to you about a potential stalker?
She did.
She did.
Sometimes she would contact us and say, "You won't believe this guy was following me around. I felt weird." I'm pretty sure she did not report it.
It was never used like, hey, I have a stalker, like this ongoing thing. She goes, I went through the self-checkout. I noticed this person in the self-checkout kind of behind me.
She like record him?
She did not. I think she was just like, I gotta get the heck out of here.
She had been working an internship.
Of course, as for the Gonçalves family, I guess they must have been told by the MPD not to give this clue to the public. I felt they hesitated to a clear and decisive give the public a clear answer about them. However, we can find some actions or reactions that prove there had been a stalker Kaylee told some people about. Why the matter of Kaylee being stalked should have been a challenging topic for the MPD, which they wanted to deny, while there has been enough compelling evidence to prove there had been such an issue for Kaylee.
Always were just such a smile on their face. This Moscow, Idaho vape shop owner says victims Kaylee Gonçalves and Maddie Mogan visited the shop about 6 times and talked about a stalker. I made a joke about it earlier. It was like, hey, coming together and stuff like that, it's nice to see you guys trying to stay safe. And one of them more or less openly says, oh yeah, we've had a friend of ours be stalked before. So this is kind of why we all travel in a group like this. And just was it Kaylee who said that? Do you remember? No, it was Maddie who actually said that. So Maddie said it, and it was kind of like more mentioning, like motioning to Kaylee too, like who was right next to her. So you could tell that like they obviously all were trying to keep Kaylee safe, and to be there for her as good friends. Yeah, to know that a few weeks later, now I won't see her, anymore, anything like that. So it's crazy.
How long before the murder about was that?
3 weeks.
3 weeks.
3 weeks.
But nothing had ever made me think as deeply as the situation you see in this video has. I couldn't let go of it easily. Let's watch it.
That you don't know of the, 400 citizens that were questioned on this survey. You don't know which ones of them did not already previously know any of the fact-specific representations in your questions. Isn't that true?
I do know because they answered yes or no to the question.
No. Oh, okay. Before you asked the question, you didn't know that. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And so somebody who hadn't heard the representation in that one slide that you acknowledged was false. Let's see. You acknowledge false that Mr. Coburger allegedly stalked one of the victims. That's false. You know that to be false.
Which one?
That Mr. Coburger allegedly stalked one of the victims.
Yes, I was trying not to say that because.
But you knew that was false.
I did.
Yes, and so you have now, for anybody who had never heard that before, that question is now planted into them unqualified representation that Mr. Coburger stalked one of the witnesses, and that's false.
That's false. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
And just to follow up on that, early on in your testimony, you testified, I want to make sure that we heard this correctly, that inadmissible or false information can be the most prejudicial information.
It can be.
Yes. And your surveyors put that false information into the minds of people who were asked that question who may not have previously heard it. Correct.
Correct. Relative to the media.
Thank you.
It's mentioned it hundreds and thousands of times.
And just make sure we're clear too. Around the same time in your testimony, I believe you testified that you don't care if the information that you put in your specific questions to the people being surveyed is correct. That you said that, didn't you?
Right. I don't know what you mean by correct.
True or false?
I care about whether or not it's proliferated by the media.
You don't care if it's true?
No, I don't. I don't care about is it prejudicial.
So it's okay to taint people who had never heard that information before for the end result identifying others who have and might have bias. Is that a fair statement?
I'm going to object to the questions.
He can answer
He's
the question.
badgering.
Wait.
Let me finish my objection.
Yeah, there's an objection.
He's badgering the witness. He's misstating his testimony, and I object.
Did you see that? Did you see how he approached this fragment of the survey? I'm sure Mr. Adelman became confused at this point. Maybe he didn't know what the point was. To Mr. Adelman, that was only a question in his surveying process, and he didn't understand what that much anger from Mr. Bill Thompson had been for. Even Ms. Ann Taylor thought he was badgering her witness. No, he didn't. He must have had something else in his mind, to me, which led me to my guess or conclusion, which is, now it's time to share my theory on this incident based on putting together the pieces of the puzzle I presented. As you see, according to the way the shop owner explained, the person who followed Kaylee had a kind of pattern and stability in his behavior. The time and the path he had stalked her were almost fixed and specific. The stalker couldn't have been a sick, low-life guy who wanted to harass her. I guess the stalker could have been Brian, considering his life pattern and his characteristics. Being busy with his studies and teaching at the university during the day, probably he could have followed Kaylee during his spare time. I think Brian had been informed about some secret interactions between these students at the university with some other students or frat guys. He could have been informed by Brent Kopaka or another person who made him curious about the students' secrets and possibly found out about a danger that was going to threaten them. Regarding his being obsessed with his studies and field of job, Brian wanted to take them under observation or maybe even to warn Kaylee about a potential danger, but she didn't give him the chance. Their secret activity could have been related to narcotic matter or money. I believe that Brian might have been around the victim's house 12 times or so. Also, I believe whatever has been said related to his cell phone pings, however, they couldn't be relied on as solid and concrete evidence for accusing him of murder. Moreover, I think the voice Dylan had heard saying to the effect of, "It's okay, I'm going to help you," could have been Brian's voice said to the victim, but not as a killer who wanted to take the situation under control or for whatever else, but also as a person who had taken them under observation for some time, and that night, after being informed the threat that had been looming over them had materialized, he might have gone there to find out what had happened. In the animation has been made by someone, which you are going to watch in a minute. It is shown that the driver had driven around the house several times until at some point he decided to enter the house, which to me, it is impossible that was the killer. I can accept he could have been Brian but not the killer, because the killers wanted to murder 4 people, which is not the joke, and wouldn't do such risky behavior to make a grand parade driving around. The murderers in such situations try to minimize the possibility of being seen, not driving back and forth to attract any potential attention to themselves.
Approaching the house, he noticed the lights are on. This hinders his plan and he now has to rethink things. He continues on to the back where he sees even more lights on. From the affidavit, we know he drove by the house 3 times in less than 5 minutes, probably trying to figure out what to do next. He finally decides to leave the area for a little while, and observes the lights are on one last time in front as he drives off. Cameras show him leaving the neighborhood and exiting on Walenta Drive in this direction. It's uncertain which way he went from this point here, but we know that he is seen here, at this location, at 3:45 a.m., caught on a gas station security camera. Wondering if this could truly be a 2015 Elantra, I downloaded a known image of one with a similar angle of view. I then entered that into a 3D modeling software and added some lighting, and then tilted the camera to get a similar angle. I then animated the image to be traveling at 40 miles per hour, giving motion blur, which ended with this result. Though not scientific, we can see very close similarities that this is a 2015 Elantra. Back to the map. We see the suspect re-enters the neighborhood at 4:04 a.m. He drives up to the house and slows down. Looking at the windows, he sees the lights are now off. Continuing to the back, he checks to see if those lights are off. They are. He's excited. He knows everyone is finally in bed, but he wants to check the front one last time. As he drives down, he's filled with adrenaline, seeing the lights are all off. His brain short circuits for a second as he clumsily tries to turn around in front of the house. It fails, but he regains composure and drives on. He's caught on camera making a 3-point turn at the end of the street to return back to the residence. He does his final drive to the back of the house. Minutes later, he's entering the kitchen through the sliding glass door.
This means the time he had been there, according to his cell phone pings, was in fact after the incident had happened. The reason the timeline of the murder can't be fitted to the case is that the MPD has considered his presence time around the murder scene as the time of murder. However, his presence time being around there has been after the murder was done. Some people believe the voice that Dylan had heard could be the murderer's voice, but to me, in such a situation, the killer says something like, "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you, or I don't want to do any harm to you." That sentence and the structure which had been heard by Dylan, to me, could have belonged to a person who meant to say, "Although I don't have anything to this, I'm going to help you." When he was going out of the house, maybe to get some help, he must have seen Dylan, so, for sure, he thought when their roommate was alive and possibly knew everything. Therefore, he must not interfere in the case anymore. The reason for him driving around the house several times in the morning after the murder was because he wanted to know how the situation had gone on. But after seeing no sign of any help from 911 or the police, he became so confused and drove around and around the house to understand what was going on, because he never even imagined that their friends call for help after 8 hours delay, and whoever was in Brian's place would do as he did. Also, the reason for him being confused when he was arrested, and the reason that he said, "I didn't do anything," or he said, "I am going to be exonerated," was because he might have thought he was arrested for trespassing into the house, or anything but the murder. Thus, if I want to say what that puzzle revealed to me in one sentence, it would be this sentence. Brian had been the witness of the case, whose interference and information about the case wouldn't let the state present its own version of the incident to the public. Therefore, when I see the case this way, everything nonsense will be meaningful to me, like the misfitted information and evidence, and their attempts to get the death penalty for Brian at the very beginning of the case. The gag order, which was used one-sided by the mainstream media and made Brian's and his family's lives upside down in front of the global audience, with no concern, whereas Mr. Adelman was being treated that way by Mr. Bill Thompson and being accused of tainting 400 people's mind against the defendant through his survey process. All make sense that whatever the state had done until now can be divided into these categories that I bring a couple of examples for each one. 1. Pre-Kobergerian trial strategies. Example 1. They did whatever they could to keep the case details within their own circle and not allow themselves to lose their control over the narration of the case. Example 2. They sought a certain level of assistance from the FBI to ensure they could later leverage its credibility, but I'm sure they didn't let the FBI focus deeply on the case to find out more. Example 3. They let the public thoughts be formed by mainstream manipulation, but used the gag order to avoid having to provide logical explanations for their unreasonable claims. 2. Kobergerian trial period strategies. Example 1. They did whatever could be done for the trial to be held in Idaho, to use their local power to keep their control on the process of the trial. Example 2. Destroying the murder scene to reduce the chance of discovering any possible remaining evidence by the jury during the trial process. 3. Post-Kobergerian trial strategies. Example 1. They did whatever they could to steer the process in a way that ultimately put the end to the case, with Brian being freed and preventing the case from going further. However, to me, by the moment Brian is freed through the trial in another county, the quadruple murder case is just going to be open, and the public demand for the identity of the real killers and their motive. Example 2. The most critical precautionary action that has been taken by the state for this phase is to redact, erase, or eliminate whatever that triggers memories of the stalker issue in the public's mind. Because if it comes to clear that Brian had taken the students under observation and has learned about their secret interactions, and consequently is aware of many things related to their murder, actually it proves that the state has accused and imprisoned the witness of the case strategically to prevent the truth of the murder to be exposed by him. This is a blatant example of conspiracy, and I think it will have more serious consequences for the state, rather than the murder itself. So that was my opinion and speculations on the case. You may be wondering where the explanations provided by Mr. Cyray fit into this theory. I am going to give my explanation in this regard in my upcoming videos. I don't know how much of my theory could be correct, but if it is of no use, I'll just turn it into a book titled, When the Dawn Goes Rising,